most controversial name in the NBA right now. There are players who enter the NBA because the league believes in their game. And then there are players who enter the NBA while the entire basketball world is arguing about whether they belong there at all. Right now, Bronny James is the center of that storm. Every dribble he takes is no longer just basketball. It is evidence in a case the entire league seems to be debating. Every missed shot becomes fuel, every quiet game becomes a headline, and every minute he plays is dissected like it carries meaning far beyond the scoreboard. The question isn't new anymore. It has become louder, sharper, and more uncomfortable with every passing game. Is Bronny James truly an NBA-level guard developing under extreme pressure? Or is he the most discussed example of legacy influence the league has seen in years? Around the league, the answers are divided in a way that feels almost personal. Some former players look at the tape and see a simple reality: a young guard still adjusting to the fastest, strongest, most unforgiving level of basketball on the planet. They point to timing, confidence, and consistency as things that take time to build, especially for someone carrying expectations that no rookie should ever have to carry. But others see something completely different. They see opportunity that was never equally earned. They see roster space that could have gone to a more proven prospect. They see a system where reputation, branding, and family influence may have shifted the normal rules of entry into the league. And that's where the tension begins. Because this is no longer just about Bronny's performance. It is about what his presence represents. A league built on competition is now arguing about fairness. A system built on merit is now debating legacy. And standing at the center of it all is the weight of one of the most powerful names in sports history, LeBron James. Whether people support Bronny or question him, nobody can deny the reality his journey is being watched differently than any other young player in the league. Not because he asked for it, but because that is the reality of the world he stepped into. And as the noise around him continues to grow, one thing is becoming clear. This story is no longer just about basketball development. It is about pressure, perception, and the cost of carrying a legacy that never stops following you. Before we continue, tell me where you are watching from right now. If you think Bronny deserves more time to develop, press 1. If you think the criticism is fair, press 2. If you think the situation is being blown out of proportion, press 3. The weight of a name no one else has ever carried. In the NBA, pressure is normal. Every player feels it. Every rookie goes through it. The league is built on competition, criticism, and constant evaluation. But what Bronny James is experiencing is not normal pressure. It is something else entirely. Because for most players, the conversation is about performance first, improvement, minutes, fit within a system. But for Bronny, the conversation starts before the game even begins. It starts with his surname, and that changes everything. Some former players argue that people are rushing to judgment. They point out that development in the NBA is rarely linear. Guards often struggle early. Confidence takes time. Rhythm takes time. Even great role players once looked out of place in their first stretch of minutes. From that perspective, Bronny is simply a young player adjusting to the hardest stage in basketball under a spotlight that most rookies never have to face. But the criticism doesn't disappear. It grows because other voices inside the basketball world don't see a normal development curve. They see a situation shaped by influence. They see a roster decision that would not look the same if the name on the back of the jersey was different. That is where the debate becomes personal, not just about Bronny, but about fairness, about whether the NBA, a league that prides itself on merit, is still completely governed by it when legacy enters the equation. And that is why every possession he plays is analyzed differently. A missed shot is not just a mistake. It becomes a symbol. A defensive lapse is not just a learning moment. It becomes a talking point. In reality, Bronny is being asked to develop in a space where development itself is constantly questioned. That is a difficult environment for any young player. But for someone carrying the most recognizable surname in basketball, it becomes something heavier, something louder, something impossible to ignore. Still, within all of this noise, there is another layer most people forget. Bronny is not just a storyline. He is a player trying to build confidence in real time, trying to find consistency, trying to survive the gap between expectation and reality while everyone watches every step. And that gap is where this story truly lives. Because the NBA has seen talented rookies before, but it has rarely seen one whose every move is interpreted through a lens this intense. And as the debate continues to spread across media, former players, and fans, one question keeps returning in different forms. Is this pressure shaping Bronny? Or is it breaking the normal process every young player needs to grow? The first wave of NBA legends turning up the heat, at some point, the conversation around Bronny James stopped being quiet analysis. It turned into public pressure, the kind that doesn't stay in private conversations or scouting reports. The kind that spreads across podcasts, interviews, and social media clips until it becomes impossible to ignore. And once that happens in the NBA, the narrative takes on a life of its own. Former players began speaking more directly, not just questioning performance, but questioning the entire situation surrounding how Bronny arrived in the league in the first place. For them, this was no longer just about a rookie adjusting to speed or spacing. It was about what they believed the league was becoming. Some argued that Bronny was being placed under a microscope that no young guard could survive. Every mistake was being magnified, every weakness replayed in slow motion, and every struggle framed as proof instead of development. But others saw something more structural. They believed this wasn't just about pressure. They believed it was about access. The idea that in a league built on competition, not everyone enters through the same door anymore. And in their eyes, Bronny's presence became the clearest example of that shift. One of the strongest talking points came from the belief that opportunity in the NBA should be earned strictly through production, especially for late draft picks and developmental players fighting for roster spots. From that angle, every guaranteed minute Bronny received became part of a larger argument about fairness. Not fairness in emotion, but fairness in system. And that is where the criticism began to intensify. Because once the conversation shifts from a player's skill to the legitimacy of their opportunity, it stops being a normal basketball debate. It becomes a question about the integrity of the league itself. Still, even within this wave of criticism, there was no single unified voice. Some former players acknowledged the noise, but stopped short of condemning Bronny directly. They emphasized that young players often need time, especially in environments as demanding as the NBA. They pointed out that confidence is fragile, and once it is shaken under national attention, recovery becomes much harder. But the louder voices kept pushing the narrative forward. And every interview, every podcast clip, every quote added another layer to the perception that Bronny James was not just a developing rookie, but a symbol of a much larger debate about influence, opportunity, and modern NBA power dynamics. And as the criticism grew louder, so did the pressure around him. Not just to perform, but to justify every second he is on the floor. Because in this version of the NBA story, talent alone is no longer the only thing being evaluated. Perception has become part of the game. The voices that refuse to hold back. As the debate around Bronny James spread deeper into NBA culture, the tone shifted again. It was no longer just analysis. It became confrontation. Because at this stage, more former players stopped treating the situation like a normal rookie evaluation. Instead, they began speaking as if something unusual had happened inside the league structure itself. Something that challenged how opportunity is supposed to work. For some, the argument was simple. The NBA has always been about survival of the fittest. If you cannot produce, you lose your spot. That rule applies to everyone, regardless of name, background, or draft position. From that perspective, Bronny was being judged by the same standard that has eliminated thousands of players before him. But others pushed back, saying that comparison no longer reflects reality. They argued that modern NBA careers are shaped not only by performance, but by context. Media pressure, organizational priorities, and global branding all play a role in how players are developed and protected. And in that environment, Bronny's situation was not just about basketball, it was about visibility. The more attention he received, the more every detail of his game became amplified. A missed rotation was no longer just a mistake. It became a talking point. A quiet scoring night was no longer just an off game. It became a narrative shift, and that constant evaluation created a feedback loop where criticism fed more criticism. This is where the debate became emotionally charged, because some former players began framing the situation as unfair, not only to other prospects, but to Bronny himself. The argument was that no young player should be placed under this level of scrutiny so early in their career, especially when every action is tied to something larger than basketball. At the same time, the opposing side doubled down. They insisted that scrutiny is part of the NBA. That pressure is not an excuse. That every player who enters the league must adapt or fall behind. And in their view, Bronny's case was not unique, it was simply more visible because of who his father is. That last point changed everything, because once LeBron James enters the conversation, the debate is no longer about a single player's development. It becomes about power, about influence, about whether legacy in the modern NBA can shape outcomes in ways that previous generations never had to consider. And that is why this discussion refuses to settle. Every argument leads back to the same tension: performance versus perception, merit versus opportunity, development versus expectation. And as long as Bronny continues to step onto an NBA court, that tension does not fade, it intensifies. The nepotism debate that split the NBA world. At this point, the conversation around Bronny James stopped being subtle. It became a word that everyone was either trying to avoid or directly confronting: nepotism. For critics, this was the core of the entire situation. Not development, not opportunity, not patience, but structure. They argued that Bronny's path to the NBA could not be separated from his last name, and that the league was now operating in a space where legacy influence could reshape access in ways that challenged traditional merit-based systems. From that perspective, the argument was not emotional, it was structural. They pointed to roster decisions, draft positioning, and guaranteed opportunities that they believed would not exist under normal circumstances for a late second-round developmental player. In their view, this was not a typical case of a prospect earning time through potential. It was a case of a system bending under influence, and once that idea took hold, it became difficult to reverse. Because every minute Bronny played began to carry double meaning. On the surface, it was development, but in the narrative built around him, it became proof in an ongoing debate about fairness in professional sports. However, not everyone agreed with that framing. Supporters and neutral voices pushed back hard against the nepotism label. They argued that the NBA has always had players with connections, famous families, and unique pathways into the league. But ultimately, the league does not allow anyone to stay based on name alone. Performance still decides careers. Minutes still have to be earned, and long-term survival in the NBA has never been protected by reputation. From that angle, Bronny was not an exception to the rules. He was being tested by them under harsher conditions than most rookies ever face. Still, the divide only grew wider, because the more the nepotism argument spread, the more it shifted the focus away from basketball development and toward the legitimacy of opportunity itself. It turned Bronny into something larger than a player, into a symbol of how modern sports deal with legacy, branding, and influence. And that is where the story became difficult to contain. Not because of what Bronny was doing on the court alone, but because of what his presence represented off it. Every fan, analyst, and former player began interpreting the same situation through completely different lenses. Some saw unfair advantage, others saw unfair pressure. Some saw business decision. Others saw a young player trying to survive in an impossible spotlight, and none of them were willing to fully back down. Because once the nepotism debate enters the NBA conversation, it rarely leaves quiet. It only escalates. The pressure of carrying a name bigger than the game. In the NBA, every player carries pressure. The pressure to perform, to improve, to survive, in a league where replacement is always one bad stretch away. But for Bronny James, that pressure has a different shape. It doesn't just come from coaches or opponents. It comes from history, from expectation, from a name that is already written into basketball legacy before he ever stepped on an NBA court. And that changes how everything is judged. For many critics, this is where the situation becomes more complex than simple evaluation. They argue that no young player should have to operate under this level of global attention, where every possession is analyzed not only for what it is, but for what it represents. A missed shot is no longer just a missed shot. It becomes a statement. A defensive breakdown becomes a headline. From that perspective, the issue is not just performance, it is environment. They believe the spotlight surrounding Bronny is unlike anything most rookies experience. It is constant, global, and emotionally charged. And that kind of attention can distort development, making normal learning curves appear like failures instead of steps in growth. But others see it differently. They argue that pressure is not unique in professional sports. Every generation of NBA players has had stars, expectations, and criticism. The league is built on visibility, and if a player wants to survive in that environment, adaptation is not optional, it is required. In that view, Bronny is not being treated unfairly. He is simply being exposed to the same reality every NBA player must face, only at a higher intensity because of who his father is. And that is where the psychological layer becomes unavoidable. Because playing under a legendary name does not only affect how others see you, it affects how you see yourself. Every mistake feels larger. Every success feels questioned. Every moment becomes a comparison point to a standard set by someone else's career. That internal pressure is what many former players point to as the most dangerous part of the situation. Not the criticism itself, but the weight of expectation that never turns off. At the same time, supporters argue that this kind of adversity can also build resilience. That players who survive this level of scrutiny often develop stronger mental toughness than those who enter the league under quieter circumstances. In that sense, the challenge could become part of Bronny's growth rather than an obstacle to it. But both sides agree on one thing. There is no neutral ground in this story. Bronny James is either learning to grow under the brightest spotlight in basketball, or he is being shaped by a situation that is too heavy for any young player to carry comfortably. And until his game clearly defines the outcome, the debate will continue to follow him everywhere he goes. What the outside world never sees. Outside the cameras, outside the hot takes, and outside the constant social media debates, there is another version of the NBA that rarely gets talked about. The locker room version. This is where narratives slow down, where labels don't matter as much as daily habits, where teammates see things that highlight clips never capture. And for Bronny James, this environment tells a more complicated story than the one being debated online. Because inside a team setting, the conversation is not about legacy or controversy. It is about repetition, learning defensive schemes, adjusting to pace, building trust through effort rather than reputation. In that space, players are not evaluated as symbols, they are evaluated as teammates. Some observers within this environment describe Bronny in a very different tone compared to the public discourse. Not as a finished product, and not as a player defined by hype or criticism, but as someone still in the middle of learning what it means to operate at NBA speed consistently. That distinction mattered, because the NBA is full of players who looked uncertain early in their careers. Players who struggled with confidence, timing, and decision-making before eventually finding their role. Inside organizations, patience is often part of the process, even when the outside world demands immediate results. But even in that quieter environment, there is no escaping awareness of the outside noise. Teammates are not blind to it. Coaches are not blind to it. Everyone understands that Bronny is not just another developmental guard in the system. His situation carries attention that extends far beyond the locker room wall. And that attention changes perception. Every practice becomes more visible in hindsight. Every rotation decision becomes something people will later analyze. Even internal development steps are filtered through the expectation that this situation is different from normal rookie progression. Still, within the team structure, the focus remains simple: improvement over time. Not headlines, not narratives, just daily work, and that is where the contrast becomes clear. Because while the outside world debates whether Bronny belongs in the NBA, inside the organization, the question is more practical. How far can he grow from where he is now? That difference between public judgment and internal evaluation is one of the biggest gaps in the entire story. And it is also why the debate refuses to settle. Because depending on where you are standing, Bronny James is either a symbol of controversy or just another young player trying to earn his place in the league step by step. When the criticism stops being analysis and becomes judgment, by this point in the Bronny James conversation, the tone around the NBA had shifted again. What started as scouting opinions and early evaluations had evolved into something far more intense: judgment layered on top of expectation, and expectation layered on top of legacy. And when that happens in professional sports, the line between fair critique and emotional reaction starts to blur. For critics, this was the stage where patience had run out. They no longer framed the discussion as "he needs time to develop." Instead, the focus turned to what they believed they were already seeing: a player struggling to consistently match the speed, physicality, and decision-making required at the NBA level. From their perspective, the issue was not potential, it was readiness. And that distinction is what escalated everything. Because not ready in the NBA is not a neutral label. It is a verdict. It implies that a player is occupying space that could belong to someone else. Someone waiting in the G League, someone undrafted, someone grinding for a chance that may never come. That is where the frustration from certain former players intensified. They began to argue that the NBA is not a developmental comfort zone at the highest level. It is a results-driven environment where minutes are earned, not granted. And in that framework, any perception of preferential opportunity becomes a flashpoint for criticism. But at the same time, another reality existed underneath the noise. Bronny was still early in his professional journey, and early careers in the NBA are rarely clean or consistent. Even highly successful players have stretches where they look overwhelmed, uncertain, or out of rhythm. The difference is that most of those players are not carrying a global narrative that amplifies every mistake. That is what makes this situation unusual. Because Bronny is not only being evaluated as a basketball player, he's being evaluated as a storyline that the entire league has already decided to follow. And once that happens, neutrality disappears. Every performance becomes evidence for one side or the other. Every improvement becomes a counter-argument. Every setback becomes reinforcement of a belief someone already holds. This is what pushes the discussion beyond normal analysis. It stops being about what he is doing and becomes about what people believe he represents. That is why the criticism feels sharper here than in most rookie cases. Not necessarily because the performance is dramatically different from other young guards, but because the context surrounding it is constantly magnifying the interpretation. And as the debate continues, the NBA finds itself in a familiar place. A player trying to develop, a league watching closely, and a conversation that refuses to calm down because too many people are already emotionally invested in their version of the truth. The moment this became bigger than basketball, at a certain point, the Bronny James conversation stopped behaving like a normal NBA storyline. It stopped being confined to box score, scouting opinions, or typical rookie development discussions. Instead, it expanded into something far more chaotic, a public debate shaped by media narratives, fan reactions, and former players all feeding into each other in real time. And once that cycle begins, it becomes self-sustaining. Every performance Bronny delivers is no longer evaluated in isolation. It is instantly filtered through the larger question that has followed him since the beginning. Is this about basketball ability, or is this about legacy, influence, shaping opportunity? That question is what turned a standard developmental situation into a polarizing NBA topic. For fans, the divide became immediate and emotional. One group sees a young guard trying to adjust under extreme pressure, pointing to the reality that most rookies need time, repetition, and confidence before they find consistency at the highest level. They argue that expecting instant impact ignores how long player development actually takes in the NBA. The other group sees something entirely different. They see a league where visibility and influence can accelerate opportunity in ways that feel disconnected from production. From that perspective, Bronny is not just being evaluated as a prospect. He is being used as a reference point in a broader argument about fairness in modern professional basketball. Media coverage only intensified that split. Clips circulate faster than context. Opinions spread faster than full analysis. A single highlight or mistake can define an entire segment of discussion for hours or even days. And in that environment, nuance rarely survives. Former players, analysts, and commentators all contribute to the cycle, but often from completely different emotional positions. Some speak from experience and empathy for the difficulty of adjusting to NBA speed. Others speak from frustration, believing the league has drifted away from strict merit-based evaluation in certain cases. And somewhere in the middle of all that noise is Bronny himself, still developing, still adjusting, still trying to find stability in a role that is constantly being interpreted through external narratives he cannot control. That is what makes this situation different from most rookie stories. It is not just about performance progression. It is about perception becoming part of the product. And once perception becomes part of the game, it starts influencing how every moment is understood, discussed, and remembered. As the conversation reaches its peak intensity, one thing becomes clear across all sides of the debate. No matter what Bronny does on the court, it will always be viewed through a larger lens than basketball alone. And that is what pushes this story beyond a typical NBA discussion. It becomes a modern case study in how fame, legacy, and media can reshape the way a player's early career is experienced by the entire world. The final verdict on a modern NBA controversy: every NBA era has its defining debates. Some are about dominance, some are about rivalry, some are about style, culture, or the evolution of the game itself. But the Bronny James situation represents something different. It represents the collision of legacy and opportunity in the modern NBA. After all the criticism, all the defense, all the analysis from former players, media voices, and fans, the core of the conversation eventually comes back to one simple but uncomfortable question: how should the NBA define deserved opportunity in an era where influence, branding, and legacy are more visible than ever before? Critics argue that the league risks drifting away from its foundation if perception starts to outweigh production. From their perspective, every roster spot carries, meaning every guaranteed contract reflects a system that should reward performance above everything else. And when that balance feels disrupted, frustration naturally follows. Supporters counter that the NBA has never been purely mechanical. It has always existed at the intersection of talent, narrative, and business reality. They argue that Bronny is not an exception to the system, but a young player navigating it under conditions that are far more intense than most ever experience. Both sides, in their own way, are reacting to the same truth. The modern NBA is no longer just a sports league. It is a global media ecosystem where stories matter as much as statistics, and where players exist not only as athletes, but as symbols inside larger cultural conversations. Bronny James sits at the center of that shift, not because he asked to be, but because his name naturally pulls him into it. And through all the noise, one reality remains unchanged. Development in professional basketball is never linear. Some players rise quickly, some take years. Some struggle under pressure before eventually finding their role. And some never fully settle into what people expect of them. Where Bronny ends up on that spectrum is still unwritten. But what is already clear is that his journey has become more than a personal career path. It has become a reflection of how the NBA, media, and fans process talent, legacy, and fairness in real time. And in that sense, the conversation around him says as much about the league as it does about the player himself. In today's NBA, the hardest battle is not only proving you belong on the court, but surviving how the world chooses to interpret everything you do on it.